All right, folks. So we've had a very active hurricane season, September into the early part of October. I have Phil Klotzbach with me, and he is the lead for the Colorado State University team. And can you tell me any records we've established so far this hurricane season?
Yeah, I mean, this hurricane season is now officially above average, but it got there in a very, very unusual way. So early on, we had Hurricane Beryl, the earliest Category 5 Atlantic hurricane on record. So we got off to a very, very busy start. We had three hurricanes through mid-August, which is also quite high. But then we went through the climatological or average peak of the season was extremely quiet. So from August 20th to September 23rd, we actually had the least overall storm activity since 1994. So it was extremely quiet during the average kind of peak of the season. And then it got just absolutely bananas busy since then. We've had five hurricanes. We had three hurricanes simultaneously in October for the first time on record in the Atlantic. But then I think, obviously, most importantly, we've had two very impactful hurricanes. Hurricane Helene, which made landfall in late September, and then Hurricane Milton just a couple of days ago, hitting Florida as well. So it's been a very unusual hurricane season in that we're above normal. So the numbers look okay, like an above normal season, but we got there and not the way that you would kind of expect, given kind of historically the way these hurricane seasons behave.
So in the beginning of the season, there was some Saharan dust blowing across the Atlantic, and also we had this big sprawly and high pressure ridge that developed, and the NAO went completely negative. Do you attribute the quiet start to the hurricane season as a combination of the Saharan dust and the very warm mid and upper levels of the atmosphere across the Atlantic?
Yeah, so it was interesting. So we had a lot of dust through mid-August. And then about the time the season really, really tailed off, the dust actually dropped fairly substantially. But I do think that you're right about there was a lot, the upper level temperatures, so temperatures high up in the atmosphere, 20, 30,000 feet, were very, very warm. So the surface temperatures were warm, the ocean temperatures were warm, and that's normally a plus for hurricanes. But the upper level temperatures were so warm, it tended to kind of stabilize the atmosphere somewhat. Now, climatologically, on average, those upper level temperatures cool mid to late September, which I think is one of the reasons why we saw the season really take off once we got to the later part of September, because the ocean temperatures are still extremely warm, but the temperatures higher up in the atmosphere cool off substantially. So those storms that came off of Africa came into a much more conducive environment. So, we've had two hurricanes so in October, historically, in the tropics, you'd really very rarely get hurricanes west of or east of about 60 degrees west, so near the islands. And so Hurricane Kirk basically broke the record for easternmost formation in the tropics in October of a hurricane by like 15 degrees west or 15 degrees of longitude, which is a big record. And then Leslie came along just a few days later and broke Kirk's record by another 5 degrees. So it was weird because from late August to late September, when you normally get all these easterly waves or strong thunderstorm complexes coming off Africa, we had the ones that did were very weak, very anemic, and nothing really went, and nothing went. And then get to late September, where normally those waves are kind of getting weaker. You don't really see much development off Africa. Then it looked like late August. So it was like late September and early October looked the way that we would normally expect late August to September or to mid-September to look. So again, at the end of the season, the numbers are going to look like an above normal season, maybe hyperactive, depending on how the next few weeks play out. But we got there in an unusual way. I'm putting together a presentation right now, and I said, like, right now it's like the most unusual above normal season on record. Like it's very aclimatological the way that we've gotten there.
Do you think that Helene and Milton will be retired names?
I would be shocked. Well, certainly Helene, and certainly, I mean, Helene and Milton, certainly, I'm sure they'll be retired. Anytime you have, obviously Helene over 200 fatalities, and I mean, the damage estimates are, both of these storms are going to be very, very high. So certainly I'd be shocked if those two storms were not retired.
Do you think we'll go into a little bit of a lull in the hurricane season here through the later part of October?
Yeah, so I mean, right now it looks like her tropical storm Leslie is definitely on her last leg. She looks like she's probably on her way out in the next day or two. There's a system in the Eastern Atlantic that right now is has a somewhat of a chance of maybe forming today, but then it should weaken pretty substantially right after that. Beyond that, it kind of remains to be seen. There are some signs of maybe something in the Caribbean, maybe something near the islands from this system currently near Africa, forming in about maybe getting into a more conducive environment in 7 to 10 days. Right now, there is a lot of ridging to the north in the East Atlantic, so any systems that come off Africa should continue to track west and not recurve, so that's stuff you kind of have to monitor. Normally, as you get later in the season, the way storms normally behave is that they don't necessarily form right off Africa. If they do form, those systems still keep coming off Africa, but they form closer to the islands or in the Caribbean. So certainly now's the time of the year we definitely want to monitor the Caribbean. Caribbean is extremely warm right now. Sea surface temperatures there normally this time of year about 84. This time they're about averaging 87, 88, which 4 degrees doesn't necessarily seem like a lot in the mid latitudes, but in the tropics, that's a huge change. And so, in addition to being more fuel for storms, it also tends to create an environment that's more conducive, tends to lower the pressures, weaken the winds, and make for a more unstable atmosphere. So certainly, the season's not over. Hopefully it's over for U.S. impacts. Hopefully the season is over, but unfortunately, given the large-scale climate conditions, I think there's a reason the season ends November 30th and not October 11th. And, it's important to also realize a lot of people wanted to write off the season around September 10th because it had been quiet. So, the season's a dud. And obviously the last few weeks have shown the season has been anything but a dud. It just has been very unusual the way that it's behaved.
Have you seen a good tendency for the National Hurricane Center cone of uncertainty to actually be verifying pretty well this season?
I mean, certainly the forecast both for Helene and Milton were like the track forecast was almost dead on. Like you look at where the first track that they forecast and where it made landfall, they're both within I think Helene was 25 miles and Milton was probably 30 or 40, really, really good track forecast. And obviously that's both a function of the steering, the kind of the large scale winds that steered the storm were fairly straightforward. The models were there was a lot less spread than sometimes there is with these storms. So they were very straightforward steering, so which is great, but also just the technology has gotten so much better. And obviously the fine folks at the Hurricane Center do a great job of taking all that model data and coming up with a forecast that even with all the great model forecasts, they still tend to beat all the models by using the know-how that they have over there. So it's a tough job, but they do an excellent job. And yeah, I mean, the forecast certainly for both Helene and Milton were really spot on.
And one last question: the accumulated cyclone energy for the season has also gone a little bit above average, but kind of in an unusual way because of the couple of storms that contributed to the overall ACE value. Correct?
So accumulated cyclone energy is an integrated metric that we look at that accounts for storm frequency, intensity, and duration. And it's kind of if you're a baseball fan, I consider it like the OPS of hurricanes. It's kind of so for example, Milton's a great example. So Milton was fairly short-lived. Normally short-lived storms don't generate a lot of ACE, but because Milton was extremely strong, basically you take the winds and square them every 6 hours. So if you have a storm they measure it in knots. So if you have a 50-knot storm, it generates 1 unit a day. If you have a 150-knot Cat 5, it's 9 units a day because it's generating so much wind energy. So a storm like Milton, even though it was short-lived, generated a tremendous amount of ACE because it was so intense. So overall for the season, we are tracking above normal. We've officially met NOAA's definition of an above normal season. But like you mentioned, it got there in an unusual way. Beryl was a Cat 5, a long-lived storm, so that generated a ton of ACE, put us way ahead of schedule, and we actually dropped fairly far below normal so if you're looking at ACE from August 20th to September 23rd, the peak of the season, we had the least ACE since 1994. Since then, we've had the most ACE on record for this period. So it went from it's been just a super neurotic season. And, there's seasons that do weird things, but this one really, it's hard to find a season that had that dead of a peak and then just went absolutely berserk afterwards. And so there's a lot of factors, I think, that contributed to why the season got quiet. And then basically all those things that kind of were knocking down the season all kind of went away simultaneously. So it's basically thank God we had those conditions there during the peak of the season that we did. Otherwise, the season probably would have been absolute mayhem. But overall, the seasonal forecasts for the stronger storms are going to verify fairly well. Right now, we're at 9 hurricanes. We predicted either 11 or 12. We predicted 5 or 6 majors. We're currently at 4. Who's to say what's going to happen? But I'd be surprised if we don't at least get one more hurricane this year. But the number of storms has been a lot lower than we anticipated. We forecast 23. Right now, we're sitting at 13. And so we just haven't had many usually you get a few storms that are kind of marginal, forming more the middle latitudes from off of fronts, things like that. And we've only had one storm form outside of the tropics, and that was Isaac, which is actually a Category 2 hurricane. But we just haven't had any of these kind of weak marginal storms that you often get in busy seasons and even in quieter seasons. So just the number of storms hasn't been there, but the intense storms certainly have. And for landfalls, it's been an extremely busy season. 5 Gulf Coast landfalls is a tremendous amount. It's only one shy of the record, which was 6 set all the way back in 1886. So from a landfall perspective, it's obviously been extremely busy. Unfortunately, also from a damage and a fatalities perspective, also really on the high end of things.
Yeah, I think for the public's perspective, when it comes down to it, they will remember this hurricane season as being quite active and quite impactful. So, even though we might not reach the number of named storms, for them, they're going to remember that they were impacted by storms and much of the East was. So that's going to be, I think, the takeaway for the public, not necessarily, oh, you didn't forecast correctly the number of named storms. It's more of, okay, we were hit. The hurricane season was supposed to be active. We got hit. And we were prepared, we were told to be prepared ahead of time. And I think that'll be the takeaway this year, don't you think?
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's important to realize too for the seasonal forecast is that, we can what kind of makes an active season is generally like the large scale, so the atmosphere ocean conditions are conducive, and that's going to favor stronger hurricanes, longer lived hurricanes, and we've seen a lot of the stronger hurricanes this year. The weaker storms, they can form in more marginal environments, and they just don't necessarily correlate as well with kind of those same large scale predictors, because to get a strong hurricane you need a pretty large area of conducive conditions, and that tends to happen a lot more frequently in active seasons, and when you have basically overall the large scale is more conducive. But to get a weak, short-lived storm, the conditions can be pretty marginal. And so there's been seasons in the past that have had a lot of storms. For example, 2013 had 14 storms, which is average, had 2 hurricanes, which is well below normal. And maybe this year who knows, but maybe we end up with 14 storms. But obviously it's a very different story when you have 14 storms and you have 9 hurricanes, and when you have 14 storms and have 2 hurricanes. So the name storms is a little bit harder. Sometimes people focus on that because it's easy just to count the number of letters in the alphabet, but you're better off looking at the hurricanes and major hurricanes, because obviously the major hurricanes are usually the ones that cause most of the damage. And certainly this year between Beryl in the Caribbean and as well as in Texas, but then Helene and Milton in the U.S. Have been obviously the huge drivers of the damage this year. And Beryl was a major hurricane in the Caribbean, and then Helene and Milton both obviously major hurricanes when it hit the U.S.
Yeah, and another thing for the public too is not only focusing on the track of the storm, but other mid-latitude systems that could impact, like predecessor rain events. And that's one of the reasons why we got so much substantial rain across the East. So impacts don't just occur right along the path. They are pretty widespread, and other factors contribute to the overall, impact from the storm.
Correct. Yeah. And certainly, as you mentioned with Helene, I mean, obviously, there was a lot of damage in Florida where the storm hit, but then there was obviously the predecessor rain event. So basically, what that is effectively like you have Helene, which was in the Gulf of Mexico and had all this moisture associated with it. And basically, if you looked at the satellite, you could see all that moisture streaming well inland, all the way up, actually, all the way up into Vermont. But unfortunately, there was basically a front that stalled over the Appalachian Mountains. And so all that moisture got pulled up into that stalled front. And every time you have basically you're forcing air up along that front over a mountain range, it's going to just rain and rain and rain. So they had a ton of rain before Helene even came on shore. And so then you had that rain on top of basically the predecessor rain that was still associated with Helene that brought obviously the catastrophic flooding that we saw in North Carolina, Tennessee, all the way up into Virginia, even in the upstate of South Carolina, even a little bit in Georgia. So just a very, very widespread flooding event. We've seen similar kinds of interactions with fronts in the past. For example, Hurricane Ida in 2021 made landfall in Louisiana, but then brought tremendous flooding to, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, all the way up into New York City. So some storms are primarily coastal events, like storm like Milton. We obviously saw huge impacts in Florida, but, there weren't impacts in, say, thankfully North Carolina from Milton. But other storms are much more coastal events. Obviously, every hurricane is going to be a coastal event, but they can have really big impacts far inland. And obviously, unfortunately, with Helene, I looked at death toll today is already over 230 people. So, just horrible death toll, horrible damage. And again, anytime you stall a front over mountainous terrain and have moisture from a tropical cyclone, it's going to be a very, very bad situation. And unfortunately, we saw that unfold over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today and provide your insight. And thanks for all you do with your team, for all the information that you disseminate to the public, and for your forecasts and updates, and also all the record information that you shared with us today, because like you said, it's been an unusual tropical season, and you explained why very well. So
yeah, thanks. Yeah. It's there's gonna be a lot of papers. I'm sure somebody may write a dissertation on this year, because it's just weird, and it's been so. I'm sure this is for you too, but like the last couple weeks have been such mayhem with these storms that it's hard to wrap, because we had started a paper on this lull, like this pronounced period where nothing happened, and I was trying to work on it yesterday, and I'm like, that feels like last year, and Beryl feels like a decade ago at this point. Like, it's just, this season has been so many different seasons wrapped into one that it's hard to kind of get your head around, to go from just early as Cat 5 and everything looking like all hell was going to break loose to just nothing, and then just like a switch flipped and it was like back to just, you look at like September 20th and what the models were forecasting. Like if you look at the ensemble, I had, it's looked like August 20th in a monster year. Not September 20th. Usually you're like, well, maybe something closer to the islands, but stuff right off Africa ramping up and going, very, very unusual year. So anyway, yeah, and we do these 2-week forecasts too, and I was kind of chuckling because those we try to forecast ACE for the next 2 weeks, and we put out last Tuesday, and I was like, well, we talked about Kirk, because like Kirk's going to be long-lived, generate a ton of ACE. Leslie, the storm behind it, that could be a big ACE generator. It kind of didn't generate as much as we thought. And then we're like, well, maybe something in the Caribbean, but it's going to probably form in the Gulf, and it's going to have a short lifetime, so probably not much ACE. And I was like, well, wasn't playing on a sub 900 millibar Cat 5, so it doesn't need to last very long to generate a lot of ACE when it's sub 900 millibars. So anyway, shows how much I know. So.
We always say here in the Mid-Atlantic, when it gets dry in the summer, the only thing that's going to get us out of a drought is a tropical storm and hurricane. And by gosh, that happened in much of the Mid-Atlantic.
It's pretty remarkable. I mean, obviously the flooding was awful, but if you look at the drought monitor, they went from like a stage 2, which is pretty substantial drought, to 0 in a week. I mean, because you're dropping, I mean, nobody wants what happened in North Carolina, but from the reading the drought people, they're like, this is fantastic. We have more water than we know what to do with. So yeah, I mean, usually in the summertime, if you don't get tropical cyclones, that does lead to drought. And obviously flooding obviously is a lot more. I mean, certainly you don't want the flooding that we saw in North Carolina, but flooding is a lot more dramatic than drought, but because obviously drought is basically too many nice days in a row. But from a cost perspective to farming and to agriculture can actually be, I think the one in California, they pinged at like $100 billion. It's a lot less dramatic than, obviously a flood is horrible when you see what happened in North Carolina, but drought can be extremely expensive. So yeah, I mean, tropical cyclones, what you want is not Helene, but like maybe a quarter of Helene would have been great. Just not exactly. Or Helene without the predecessor rain event probably would have been perfect. That was really a thing, because the storm itself, when it came on shore, was like 4 to 6 inches, but obviously that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back because they had so much rain ahead of time.
Yeah, and I think it was that blocking high across New England that kept it from going up I-95, and we had the upper level low in Kentucky. So going north and east like most storm tracks do when they hit the Florida Panhandle, this one went north and west instead. Yeah,
that was a weird track. Like, it's not one up into Nashville, which is again really weird for a storm hitting the Florida Panhandle. That's not, like you said, normally you would expect that to go right up I-95 corridor, and you head up into, you'd expect really bad flooding up into the Mid-Atlantic, up into New England, and that didn't occur, but you end up with flooding in Nashville and places like that. So yeah, Helene was a weird storm. It was huge, which didn't help in terms of the rainfall impacts either. And then obviously you went from kind of the enormous Helene to this little tiny storm Milton until right before it hit. It was pretty small. So yeah. Anyway, never a dull moment.
That is correct.
All right.
Well, thanks for joining me, Phil. Appreciate the information.
Sounds good. Take care, Chad.